Let there be light. Some of those priests were kings, and those kings were understood to be. I'm getting ahead of myself and into topics for another episode. A new history was written to cover up the nation's polytheistic origins. He is called Son of Man and Son of God. It was retrojected into history to support their cause. You see, El Elyon was not the same as Yahweh. When El Elyon divided the nations, when he divided all mankind, he set borders for the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. For Yahweh's portion is his people, Israel is his allotted inheritance. But the old idea of royalty was troublesome for their new government and their new theology. How could a king be a problem for their theology? I'm sorry, I'm getting into a topic best left for another episode. Before the destruction of the First Temple, before the Babylonian Exile, the view of the monarchy was... Once again, I'm getting into a topic best left for another episode, which I promise is coming soon. And for good reason. Those manuscripts were all destroyed, not by the Assyrians or the Babylonians, but by the Second Temple priests. But again, I'm getting off topic. Before the Babylonian exile, some of those priests were kings, and those kings were understood to be... I'm getting ahead of myself, and into the topics for... Those are topics for this episode. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons and Genesis. When we think about Christianity, we view time as being divided into two distinct periods, BC and AD, with the birth of Christ as the dividing line. What came before, the Old Testament, sets the stage. What comes after, the New Testament, is the foundation for the religion. But imagine if we didn't have the Old Testament. How confusing might that be when a character quotes from ancient scripture or references a prophet or a lawgiver or an event? We would be lost. We'd have no way of truly understanding the context of the New Testament. When Jesus speaks of the law of Moses, we'd be scratching our heads and asking ourselves, who is Moses? It might surprise you to know that such a division exists within Judaism as well. In 586 BCE, the Jerusalem temple was destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar, and the survivors were carted off to Babylon, thus ending the First Temple period and beginning the exilic period. Decades later, Cyrus the Great of Persia would end their exile, and his nation would fund the construction of a new temple, beginning the Second Temple period. But along with the new building would come a new theology. There were outside influences from their Persian masters, their Babylonian captors, and even the exiled Jews themselves. The new theology clashed with the old. Priests of the ancient temple cult were eventually driven out, exiled from their own city by their own kin, and a new set of beliefs became standard practice. Alien ways became orthodox, and the new priests and scribes assembled and edited a collection of stories, compiling a new scripture with new teachings that argued against the traditional ways. The religion of their fathers was outlawed, and a new history was written for the nation, one which favored the new theology. The new history would become known as the Deuteronomic history, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And the new theology was the Torah. We're familiar with the text and its message, just as we're familiar with the New Testament, the Garden of Eden, the Tower of Babel, Moses, Joshua, and Judges. Those texts have been the basis of every episode of this podcast thus far. But every book of the Old Testament, even those which originated from the First Temple period, passed through the hands of Second Temple scribes. They've all been redacted to support the new theology, something I will call Mosaic theology, as it is centered around the story of Moses and the Exodus. But prior to the Babylonian exile, the Israelites recalled a very different history from their nation and their people, and knew nothing of Moses or any Exodus story. In fact, prior to the Babylonian exile of 586 BCE, the story of Exodus and the name Moses is completely absent from Jewish literature. So, what existed before? What was the First Temple like? Why were the Second Temple priests so vehemently opposed to their old religion? And why were agents of Persia personally sent to make changes to the doctrine of the Second Temple? It's a complex topic, one that will occupy the next several episodes and launch us all the way into the 1st century AD. It begins, as every story does, at the beginning. The very beginning, or rather, what was left out of the beginning. I'm referring to Genesis chapter 1 and the creation of the universe, because to understand the First Temple, we must first understand what the First Temple represented. In Exodus 24, verses 15 to 16, Moses goes up onto the cloud covered Mount Sinai to meet with Yahweh. He visits Yahweh for 6 days, and then, on the seventh, the deity begins giving instructions on how to build the temple. Modern readers might be a bit confused by this, as we might not see any reason for a week-long delay. Why not give Moses the instructions immediately? But ancient readers would have understood the importance of this passage of time. For the first 6 days on the mountain, Moses was witnessing the creation of the universe. Yahweh was showing it to him so that he could better understand the construction of the temple, for which he'd receive instructions immediately after the vision concluded. But why would Moses need to see the creation of the world in order to understand the building and the arrangement of the temple? Because, and this is very important, the first temple was creation. I'm going to warn you now that temple theology is filled with this idea that one thing was also another. It was a defining characteristic of that particular theology, and it's vitally important for understanding this topic that you accept this idea. The heavenly palace of the gods, the Garden of Eden, the Jerusalem temple, and the earthly creation were not 4 separate places. They were originally thought of as a single place that existed both in heaven and on earth. Think of it like a single object with 2 lights shining on it. It's one object, but it casts 2 shadows. One shadow is in heaven, the other shadow is on earth. But it's a single object. Events which occurred on earth happened because they were also occurring in heaven. The ancient Israelites understood the holy temple to be Eden and to be the natural creation. Now, this isn't the Garden of Eden mentioned in Genesis 2. That's a later version of Eden. This is the original idea of Eden and the entire world as they saw it. An Eden mentioned in Ezekiel 27 and 28, a mountain palace garden where the gods lived, filled with angels. The earthly temple was the duplicate of Eden, its reflection. 2 images, but only one object. One early midrash states, and I quote, "The tabernacle is equal to the creation of the world." Christians living in Egypt as late as the 6th century CE recalled the tradition of the order of creation being replicated in the building of the temple. And a look at the order of creation side by side with the arrangement of the first temple reveals these parallels. The Exodus story recalls the details of the Old Temple, though it also seeks to replace the original theology of Israel. On the first day, El Elyon created light. This wasn't ordinary light, but the light of the world, a title associated with Yahweh. He is also considered an agent of creation, meaning that El Elyon went on to create the rest of the universe through Yahweh, the first angel. However, there is speculation that El Elyon created El Shaddai, also called Asherah, at this time, and along with his newly created consort, they together created Yahweh and the rest of the angels. Further confusing the matter is the fact that Asherah is also associated with the divine light. This would parallel many ancient Mediterranean creation myths in which a father and mother deity become parents of the universe and the entire pantheon. And in light of other details concerning the role of Asherah in First Temple Theology, I tend to lean toward this understanding. Either way, El Elyon first created a divine light, and that light became the agent of creation for the rest of the universe. The rest of the heavens were made, along with all of the angels who were called the heavenly host, also called the sons of God. Among them were 70 special angels, which were set aside for a specific purpose, but we'll come back to that. This heavenly realm was the centerpiece of the first temple, the Holy of Holies, where a golden chariot throne sat. It was called the heart of creation and the source of life. Though much of this description was removed by the Deuteronomists, they didn't do the best job cleaning up and accidentally mentioned the host of angels in Genesis 2:1, when the creation account was capped with, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of angels with them." There was a specific reason they were deleting the angels, the mention of Yahweh on day 1, and other details, which I'll come back to. On the second day, El Elyon separates the heavens from earth. Heaven is now hidden away, just as the Holy of Holies is hidden by the second component of the temple veil. The heavens are not meant for mere mortals. That is the realm of angels. Likewise, the Holy of Holies is no place for common men or even priests. Only the high priest may enter. And there's a specific reason for that, which we'll come to at the end of the episode when we discuss who the high priest was. The veil is woven from 4 different colors of thread: red, blue, purple, and white. Both Philo of Alexandria and Josephus stated that the belief here was that the 4 colors represented the 4 elements of creation. Red was for fire, blue for air, purple for water, and white for earth. The same color scheme is used for the robes of the high priest, so the words in Wisdom 18:24, "On his robes the entire world was depicted," become clear. The high priest is wearing the colors that represent creation. This veil was also said to be embroidered with cherubim, though this detail is edited out of the Deuteronomist accounts. On the third day, the earth is covered in plants of all kinds. All of the food eaten by humans, except for meat, was given to them on the third day of creation, thus bringing us to the next component in the temple: the table for bread offerings, wine, and incense. Here the priests would make offerings from those same plants to Yahweh. On the 4th day, El Elyon set up the great lights in the sky. There are 7 great lights that the ancient Israelites recognized. These are the sun, the moon, and the 5 known planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The religious festivals were arranged by the movements of the sun and moon, thus creating lights to govern the days and the years. But there's a deeper meaning here. The book of Zechariah mentions the patrolling eyes of Yahweh, eyes that watch over the whole world, and these eyes are said to be the 7 lamps of the menorah. Those eyes appear again in Psalm 87, where the eyes of Yahweh are present in Zion as he records his elect. And Zechariah 5:14 records that standing by the menorah was the same as standing by the Lord of the whole earth. This too would be removed by the Deuteronomist, Descriptions of the temple by those editors leave out the lamp, and the menorah was absent from the Second Temple. On the fifth day, El Elyon created all of the beasts of the earth, creatures of the sea, and birds and flying things. Essentially, every non human animal. And as we continue our look at the temple, we come to the altar. This is where burnt offerings were made to Yahweh, offerings of the flesh of animals. A detailed description of this altar can be found in episode 22. The first temple was believed to be Eden. Again, not exactly the Garden of Eden from Genesis 2, but a heavenly palace garden atop a mountain where the gods lived, a symbol of the earthly creation. Descriptions of the first temple mention stars and constellations painted on the ceiling to represent the heavens, and pools of water to represent the seas and rivers. Ezekiel gives us a good description of the first temple. It was constructed on a high mountain, Ezekiel 42 and 43:12. The courtyards were decorated with palm trees, 40:31 and 34. The inner parts of the temple were decorated with palm trees and two-headed cherubim, 41:5. From the temple came a river which brought supernatural fertility to the land of Israel, 47:1 through 12. All of these features were attested elsewhere in the Old Testament. The Old Temple also held a bronze serpent, 2 Kings 18:4, and a golden chariot throne adorned with cherubim. But according to the Deuteronomic account, there's no emphasis on the Eden motifs. The ark is just a box. There's no divine throne, no living waters, no mountain setting, no role for the cherubim, no tree of life, and no menorah. Why remove those things? Why erase their own religion? Because their new theology and system of government wouldn't allow the old. It starts with the beings. Now, we've already mentioned El Elyon numerous times on this podcast, so I won't go into much detail here. But he was the high god of the Canaanite pantheon. In fact, the name El Elyon literally means God Most High. He's God the Father, creator of the entire pantheon, which includes the 70 sons of God, and also the creator of the entire universe. He's the one who's active in the six-day creation story. El Elyon had a wife named Asherah, also called Asheratah, or El Shaddai, a name which means the God with breasts. She appears numerous times in the Old Testament, including Ezekiel and Genesis. She's sometimes called the Living One, Wisdom, the Great Lady, the Queen of Heaven, and the Spirit. To date, some 854 figurines of her have been found in Jerusalem and Judah. She is always associated with light, and one of her symbols is a winged sun. Many of the figurines depict her holding a spindle, which is used for weaving. I'd suggest hanging on to that little detail because it will come up later. In Proverbs 8, we read about the Spirit of wisdom inside the Holy of Holies with God Most High. She was there when the Creator engraved the circle on the face of the deep, set the engraved mark for the sea which it could not pass, and engraved the foundation of the earth. Proverbs 8:27-29. This is Asherah, God's wife, God the Mother, the Spirit. Another reference in Malachi 4:2 is often deliberately mistranslated. It reads, "The Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in her wings." Modern publishers change her to his or its, and sometimes mention in a footnote that the pronoun is ambiguous or gender neutral. But it isn't. It's feminine singular, her. And that makes sense, because a sun with wings is the symbol for Asherah. God the Father and God the Mother, or the Spirit, then created the host of heaven. These were the sons of God, beginning with the 70 great angels, whose job it would be to rule the nations. This particular bit of mythology is referenced in Deuteronomy 32:8, but not in most Hebrew manuscripts. It survives in the Greek Septuagint and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where it states that God Most High divided the nations of the world among his sons, and his favorite nation, Israel, was given to Yahweh. This brings us to Yahweh Sabaoth, a name that literally means Lord of the Army or Lord of the Host. He's an angel like the rest, another son of God, but he's first among them. The book of Job even mentions how Yahweh sits in a council among his peers and is even challenged by them. He's the patron god of Israel, just as Marduk is the patron god of Babylon. He's called King of the Heavenly Host, Son of the Father, and the Holy One. But mostly, he's just called Lord. Now, at this point, you might be thinking that God the Father, God the Mother, who is sometimes called the Spirit, and God the Son, who is called Lord, sounds a bit too much like the Catholic idea of the Trinity. If you made that connection, you'll be disappointed to know that I won't be crawling down that particular rabbit hole in this episode. You see, it goes too deep and branches out too far to be covered here. So, the Christian connection to the First Temple Theology will get an episode all its own. After Yahweh came the other angels, not just the 70, but thousands, as numerous as the descendants of Abraham were promised to be. In fact, they weren't just as numerous as the stars in the sky, they were thought to be the stars in the sky. Remember when I said that sometimes one object was actually two different things? Or rather, two different things were one? The stars were angels. There are numerous references to this belief, such as Job 38:7, Psalm 147:4, Isaiah 40:26, Deuteronomy 4:19, and Psalm 148:3, along with about 24 others. These angels had many jobs. Most notably, their job was maintaining creation. El Elyon had carved the rules of the universe into the creation. A great circle of runes contained the ocean, preventing it from spilling out. The paths of the stars were written in the sky, and the angels, who were these stars, followed along these paths. The laws of nature were all physically inscribed by El Elyon, with Asherah, the spirit of wisdom, assisting him. Her wisdom, the true wisdom, made his work perfect. From her came the knowledge to do such things. This perfect creation that was written into the world was called the Everlasting Covenant. This covenant is about the purity of creation, and we see it for the first time in Genesis immediately following Noah's flood, when the earth had been purified. Later covenants appear, such as the pact with Abraham or at Sinai when Moses was given the commandments. The fourth covenant appears in 2 Samuel 7:12 when God promises to establish a royal house with Israel. Another is in Jeremiah 31:34, which would be written in the heart. But only this first covenant, which addressed the cleansing of creation, is ever referred to as the everlasting covenant. Only it deals with the remission of sin. But how did this perfect creation become corrupt in the first place? It started with the heavenly host, the sons of God, who also had access to wisdom, to knowledge, and some of them didn't use it responsibly. A brief reference to this belief appears in Genesis 6:4 when we learn that some of the sons of El Elyon fathered children with human women to create a corrupt race of demigods called Nephilim. This passage is immediately followed by the Noah's flood story. But to understand the context, we must step outside the Old Testament and read another book, the Book of Enoch. The early sections of Enoch were written around 300 BCE by a group of Jews who still followed First Temple Theology, but had been exiled from their own city by the Jews who had returned from Babylon. They preserved the older traditions and brought their theology to life in stories such as Enoch. Enoch is sort of like Zoroastrianism. It's a huge influence and a topic I repeatedly reference, but not one that I've done an episode on. If you've ever watched an episode of Supernatural in which someone bound a demon by writing an incantation on the floor, then you've seen the effects of Enoch on pop culture. The great heavenly battles depicted in the Christopher Walken movie The Prophecy, or pretty much the entire plot of the 2014 Russell Crowe film Noah, comes from the book of Enoch. In that book, we learn that a group of angels, sons of God, grew prideful and attempted to take El's throne. For the sin of pride, they were punished, cast out of heaven and down to earth. Most notably among them were Shemahaza, the leader, and Azazel, sometimes called the Strong One. This Strong One makes an appearance in Mark chapter 3 when Jesus is exorcising a demon and talks about binding a strong one. As angels, the fallen possess knowledge unknown to humans. They use a corrupt knowledge to teach humans how to make weapons and armor, witchcraft and enchantments, astrology and alchemy. They also taught women to dye their hair and paint their eyes and wear jewelry. These decorated women then become a temptation for the fallen angels, who then fathered children with the human women. These half-breeds were known as the Nephilim, some of which were hundreds of feet tall, and this fall of angels and the corrupt knowledge they spread is how evil entered the perfect creation. First Temple Theology has no mention of the fall of man from Genesis 3 in their history. According to them, evil did not come from temptation of humans in a garden, but from prideful angels in heaven. In fact, the idea of the fall of man as the origin of evil is such a late addition to the Old Testament that no narrator, no psalm, and no prophet makes a single recognizable reference to it. If this were where Second Temple theology actually believed evil came from, they would have to mention it somewhere. Yet the origin of evil is a point of contention throughout the Old Testament. Everything from ritual impurity to breaking an ancient custom to allowing certain people to live is blamed for the existence of evil. Yahweh is even the creator of evil in Isaiah 45:7. If they had believed the Eden story to be evil's origin, the debate wouldn't have existed. Or if the topic of evil was raised, someone in the debate would have to mention the fall of man. But the Eden eviction wasn't about the origins of evil, at least not at first. Originally, it was about the First Temple priests being ejected from the temple by the reformers. Asherah, who is sometimes depicted as a tree of life and a tree of knowledge, was once worshipped there, but that worship ceased, and Asherah, along with her followers, were ejected. And the seeking of pure knowledge associated with Asherah and the First Temple theology became taboo subjects in the Second Temple period. The Eden story of Genesis 3 was likely a very late addition written by sympathizers of the old cult who portrayed the intolerant reformers as Yahweh himself, and thus managed to slip the story into Scripture. But before that, the idea of evil came from these fallen angels and their corruption of divine knowledge. And this not only corrupted humans, but creation itself. So Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel appealed to El Elyon and convinced him to purify creation. The process of purification came in two parts. The fallen angels, who brought sin into the perfect creation, were bound and sealed up inside the earth. Raphael bound Azazel and sealed him up in a deep valley in the desert, which would be named after him, and all of sin was ascribed to Azazel. Michael bound Shemhaza and the other angels who had mated with human women. They would all be bound until the day of judgment, when they would finally be cast into fire and destroyed. The second part of the purification of creation was the purging of the Nephilim and the wicked men who knew only war and evil. This was the Great Flood. The archangel Uriel gave instructions to Noah to make his preparations. Though the earth was purged of evil men, fallen angels, and the Nephilim, creation itself was still corrupted, and because of this, regular atonement had to be made in an attempt to heal the damage, and restoring the covenant of creation required blood sacrifice. Not all of the angels on earth were evil, though. They were not all evil, fallen creatures. Those 70 sons of God created on the first day, those had a special role, and this may be the most difficult portion of the entire episode to follow, and is certainly the most controversial. The 70 sons of God that were set aside from the other angels were the kings of all the nations of earth. Let me reiterate that. According to First Temple Judaism, the kings of every nation on earth were actually deities born of Asherah, fathered by El Elyon, God kings, and the king of Jerusalem was no exception. And you don't need to read extra biblical material to find references to this idea. Divine royalty is referenced in the Old Testament in such places as Ezekiel 27:8, Isaiah chapters 14, 24, 33, and 37, Exodus 24:9 through 11, Psalm 82, and many, many, many others. The kings and princes of nations were gods. They were divine. In Isaiah 14, we read of the fate of one such king, in this case, the king of Babylon. Isaiah 14:4. He is described as a star in the sky and as an angel. Isaiah 14:12. The king of the angels, Yahweh, has cast the angel king of Babylon down for the crime of attempting to set his throne above El Elyon's. Isaiah 14:13-14. As a result, the king of Babylon was humbled. Isaiah 14:15-17. In reference to the king of Israel, Isaiah 9:6 states, "For a child has been born to us, a son hath been given to us, and the princely power is on his shoulders. And he is called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Father of Eternity, and Prince of Peace." Daniel 4:13 describes how a Holy One, another word for a ruling angel, comes from heaven. It's described as a watcher, a term used in Enoch for angels on earth, both good and evil. This Holy One deals in politics and heavenly decrees from El Elyon. Psalm 2:6-7 states that the King of Zion is the Son of God. And speaking of kings in Psalm 82, we read, "You are gods, you are all sons of the Most High." The highest angel, Yahweh, was given dominion over Israel. The kings who ruled from Jerusalem were the earthly incarnations of Yahweh. Since there was no division at that time between government and temple, the king of Zion was the high priest of Jerusalem. The king of Israel was the king of heaven. The high priest was Yahweh. The throne in the Jerusalem temple was called the throne of God, Yahweh, the national God of Israel. Yahweh sat on this throne as the high priest of the temple. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest wore a seal on his forehead bearing the secret name of Yahweh, identifying himself with the deity, and entered the Holy of Holies, where only Yahweh was allowed to dwell. The eternal presence of Yahweh was represented by the menorah, which was not only absent from the Second Temple, but outlawed. When the priest king died, and another took his place, he was not a new king. He was a new incarnation of the same deity which had ruled from the high seat of creation since the beginning of time. The first temple, the earthly creation, the mountaintop palace garden of the gods, the heavenly palace, Eden, one place with one king, for 4 centuries. His name might be David or Solomon, but he was Yahweh. He was the Son of God Most High. He was the high priest who was sometimes called Melchizedek, who met with Abraham and atoned for sin through his own self-sacrifice by pouring out his own blood for the renewal of creation. This is what was believed and practiced in Israel for centuries. So why did this religion die out? Why were its adherents cast out by the Second Temple priests? Why did worshippers no longer hold to the idea of a divine king as the Son of God and an earthly incarnation of Yahweh? Why did they merge El Elyon and Yahweh and Asherah into a single deity? Why was the throne absent from the Second Temple? Why abandon all of their other gods? Why abandon the promised coming of Melchizedek, their Messiah? Why erase the entire history of the Jewish monarchy, which stretched almost 400 years, and replace it with fictive stories of David and Solomon? You see, after the Babylonian exile, the Second Temple was financed by the new rulers from the east, the Persian Empire. Kings were no longer allowed in Jerusalem, especially if they were divine. And they had a new Messiah, the true king, Cyrus the Great, who, unlike the king of Jerusalem, was actually able to defeat Babylon. And they were being given a new theology, partially grown during the exile and partially promoted by the Persians. It was given to them by Persian agents such as Ezra and Nehemiah, who delivered a strange new idea to Israel, one which promoted the existence of only one God, judgment for sins, and the concept of the afterlife. Immortality for the righteous was suddenly offered by this new and alien religion from the East. But to understand the changes which gave birth to Second Temple theology, we'll first need to understand the origin of those changes. This strange religion from Persia, the oldest surviving monotheistic religion in the world. The religion which is known as... I'm sorry. Once again, I'm getting into a topic which is best left for another episode. Please like us on Facebook at facebook.com/dragonsandgenesis. You can find source material for this episode on the resources page of my website at dragonsandgenesis.com. It'll be 2 books entitled Temple Theology, An Introduction, and The Older Testament, both by Margaret Barker. There you can also contact me with any questions or comments that you might have. Be sure to leave a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. And as always, thank you for listening.